Anam's novel The Good Muslim. So, Tahmima Anam's novel The Good Muslim, set in Dhaka after the Liberation War, it focuses on Maya Haq, a doctor who returns to Dhaka in 1984 after spending 7 years in Rajshahi. So, when she comes back, she finds that her brother 𝐒𝐲𝐚𝐽, who was once a freedom fighter, now became a religious leader. Their different beliefs also create conflict within the family. Along with their mother Rehana, 𝐒𝐲𝐚𝐽's son Jahid, and their friend Joy, they all struggle with the lasting impact of the war. At first, it may seem that Dhaka is simply setting, but today I will explore Dhaka that carries memories, reflects conflict, and changes over time, also influences the character in the novel. Moving to the next slide, this novel brings the memory of the Liberation War through the character Pia, who is discovered by 𝐒𝐲𝐚𝐽 in an army barracks in novel's prologue. However, independence did not bring peace or stability. Uh, as the narrator mentioned, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's assassination also became important in the novel, and it's reflected the city's streets, which I will discuss later. After his death, Dhaka went through years of political unrest with coups, counter coups, and military rule. The novel also refers to the country's ruler as the dictator. Although this clearly reminds us of General Irshad's period of rule, but Tahmima Anam never mentions him by name. Instead, she shows his power through propaganda posters, curfews, and atmosphere of fear in the city. This was also a time when the secular ideas of the Liberation War came into the conflict with growing religious conservatism. In the novel, this change is shown through Tabligh Jamaat movement, which also becomes powerful influence on 𝐒𝐲𝐽. So moving to the next slide, this novel also mentions the dictator wanted to rename the country the Islamic Republic of Bangladesh. Now, the prologue in the novel also takes place in December 1971, just 8 days after the war ends, and introduces the 𝐒𝐲𝐽's trauma. The main narrative is set between February 1984 and February 1985 during martial law. At the same time, flashbacks of 1972, 1974, and 1977 also explain how 𝐒𝐲𝐽 changed and why Maya left Dhaka. Also, the epilogue moves to 1992 and ends with the real historical events of Bono Adalat by Jahanara Imam. So, this timeline covers years when Bangladesh was struggling over its identity and its future, and Dhaka was also changing. Now, moving to the next slide, Dhaka is not just setting in this novel but a living character. The first thing we notice that Tahmima Anam described Dhaka like a living character. She uses words like illness, growth, decay, healing, instead of just describing the street and buildings. So, when Maya returns after 7 years, the city does not feel welcoming to her. Instead, it overwhelms her. Everything felt very loud and good. Even the raise of the volume, the air also filled with garbage and so many dirty things. This description make the city feel alive but unhealthy and exhausted at the same time. So moving to the next slide, the same idea also appears in Maya's family home as she approaches her childhood house at number 25. She notices that a house became gray and the drain pipe had leaking. And on the roof, 𝐒𝐲𝐽's religious community also has been growing, as though an entire village had fallen from the sky and landed on the rooftop. The house is changing like a living body. So, moving to the next slide, the Dhaka also struggles with the overcrowding. When Maya visits her father's grave, she notices that the graveyard looked smaller and building crowded around all the sides. She also remembers reading the city was running out of space. It was growing fast and built further and further away. Like a living body under pressure, Dhaka no longer has enough room even for its dead. Now, Dhaka also becomes a character through memory. The city remembers the past, but those memories are constantly being erased or replaced. Now, moving to the next slide, one example is the renumbering of the street. Maya discovers that her own road has changed from Old 13 to New 6A. Even more painful is the change to Road 32, where Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was assassinated. Uh, uh, The novel also mentions that you could no longer say it happened at 32 number. You would have to say it was road 26A, a new road on which no man had been killed. By changing the street names, the government changes how people remember history. Maya describes this confusion as feeling like a half swallowed pill stuck in her throat. The city cannot fully forget, but it cannot also speak freely either. Moving to the next slide, this idea also appears in the city's monuments. Shoik Minar, which had been destroyed during the war, has been rebuilt and it became taller and wider. However, Maya says that she wished they had left it broken because now it's freshly painted and it bore no signs of the struggle. The monument itself has been restored, but the signs of history has been disappeared. Moving to the next slide, the same thing also happens at Polton Moidan. Once the place where Mujib gave historical speeches and where the Pakistani army surrendered, it has also turned into Cheshu Park or Cheshu Mela. Maya is shocked by this change. She imagines the park filled with newspaper fonts of roasted peanuts and things it was where for a moment they had owned. Now their history would be papered over by peanuts and smell of candy floss. Joy also tells her that the first time he saw it, he also cried too, after seeing what happened to the place. His response shows that this loss is shared by many people who lived in the war. So moving to the next slide, at the same time, the government replaces old memories with new ones. The city covered with slogans calling the ruler general of our hearts with pleasure of him 10, 20 feet tall. Dhaka is no longer only forgetting its past, it is being forced to remember a different story. Now moving to the next slide, Dhaka also becomes a literary character because it is divided in its ideology also. Different beliefs and different ideas fight for control of the same city. The best example is the Hawk family. The ground floor belongs to Rehana. The rooftop, however, belongs to his son Sohel and his religious followers. Over time, the rooftop also grows from a one room into a large community with 20, 30 people in there. The family even built a separate staircase so they could come and go without disturbing the people downstairs. The house itself becomes a symbol, we can say, symbol of a divided nation. Now, moving to the next slide, also the people from countries like France, Russia, and South Africa arrived in Shoel's house. Sophia jokes that it felt like United Nations up there. The conflict between secular nationalism and the religious revivalism is no longer only a political, it's also happening inside the family home. So now moving to next slide. The same division also appears across Dhaka. Under martial law, the government does not allow gathering of more than 5 people. When student protests near New Market, Maya watches as the policemen looked like angry housewives and smash their rolling pins on the backs of the front line. Now moving to the next slide. However, the same government allows millions of people to attend the 𝐒𝐲𝐚𝐬, where the dictator would be attending the final recitation, also blessing from spiritual leaders from the Jamaat. This shows that public space is controlled according to political and religious interests. The city itself becomes a place where different ideas and struggles for power. So, moving to the next, so far, these examples show that Dhaka is much more than background of the novel. It suffers like a living body, remembers and forgets like a human mind, and becomes a battlefield where different ideas compete with each other. Okay, so far we have seen that Dhaka behaves like a living literary character, but now I also want to explore how Dhaka influences the character in the novel. For example, Maya. When Maya returns to Dhaka hoping to continue her old life, this Dhaka forces her to face many challenges. For example, in 𝐒𝐲𝐽 she immediately feels out of place, surrounded by women wearing expensive clothes and people drinking imported whiskey. She became self-conscious and described herself as too old and too young, ugly spinster in an ugly sari. This city does not make her she belongs in here anymore. Dhaka also changes Maya politically. She begins writing for an underground newspaper in Old Dhaka near a tannery where she says it smells like death. Later, she also joins Jahanara Imam's tribunal movement in Kolabagan, which eventually leads to her arrest and trial for treason. Eventually, Dhaka does not allow Maya to remain the same person she was before. Now, for her brother Sohel. Sohel's transformation is also closely connected to the spaces of Dhaka. Before the war, he was known as the tortoise that beat the Khan, a young man who loved debate and ideas. After the war, however, he slowly withdrew from his ordinary life. Later, he moves to Kakrail Mosque where Maya stopped at the entrance and she is told that women were not allowed and she must leave immediately. Later, Sohel moves to a newly built mosque on Ghost Town. His journey begins with another important place, Joshua Road. It is the place where during the war he accidentally kills an innocent man. That moment changes him forever. His movement from one religious space to another, and finally, his decision to leave for Saudi Arabia shows his gradual withdrawal from the secular life in Dhaka. And for Jahid's story also shows how strongly place shapes a person's life. Instead of sending him to regular school in Dhaka, his father Sohel sends him to madrasa on a remote island. This place is so isolated that Maya has to travel by train, ferry, and hired boat, even wearing borrowed burqa just to find him. In the end, Jahid drowns in the Jamuna River. Earlier, the river described as pounding its banks, demanding its passes. Just like Dhaka, this river also shapes people's life, and in Jahid's case, it leads to tragedy. And for Joy, when Joy returns to Dhaka after spending several years driving taxi in New York, when he returns to Dhaka, he also connects with his past. He remembers traveling through crowd and welcoming Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Later, he and Maya slowly rebuild their relationship in cafe on Elephant Road. They stand outside the locked gates of the former Polton Moidan where they share their grief over the past. And unlike other characters, Rihanna never leaves Dhaka. She rents her house to a German tenant, looks after her garden, and continues with her everyday life. At first, she seemed to be most stable character in the novel. However, even Rihanna cannot escape the effects of the Dhaka's history. During the Liberation War, believing Sohel had died, she cuts the family's marriage bed in half so that Maya can have a bed on her own. After Sohel returns, the bed is repaired, but the novel mentions it still carries a thin line visible if you look closely, a long meandering thunderbolt. So, like Dhaka itself, Rihanna's home appears repaired, but the scars of the past never completely disappear. Moving to the next slide. So, through Maya, Sohel, Jahid, Joy, and Rihanna, we can see that Dhaka is not simply a place where people live. It is the place that shapes their identity, influences their decision, and leaves a lasting marks on their lives. In this way, Dhaka acts like a literary character and affecting every person in the novel. So now moving to the next slide. Now I would like to look at different places in Dhaka that appear in the novel. Each location has a special meaning and helps us to understand the novel and its character. Now moving to the next slide. Dhanmondi. Dhanmondi is the emotional center of the novel. It is where the Hawk family lives, where Maya runs to Dhanmondi Lake every morning, and where the Road 32 is renamed. This is the place where personal memories and national history come together. Old Dhaka is home to the underground newspaper where Maya works. This location also reflects a danger that a danger and secrecy of speaking against the government. Bulshan also represent wealthy and privileged. At Saima's party, people drink imported whiskey and admire paintings. Maya realizes that these pictures do not reflect the real life of the poor people she treated in the villages. Bulshan show a group of people who are separated from the country's reality. So for Kolabagan, 𝐒𝐲𝐚𝐜𝐴 is another important place because it brings together two very different areas. It is where Maya attends Janara Imam's tribunal meeting and becomes more politically active. At the same time, the same area leads to Shoel's second mosque. In this Kolabagan, political activism and religious revival exist side by side at the same city. Kakrail is where Sohail later worships, especially in Kakrail Mosque. It is also a place where Maya is stopped at the entrance. This movement shows us that not only distance between brother and his sister, but also barriers created within the Dhaka. And now moving to the next slide, and Shohid Minar and Paldon are two of the most different places in our national memory. As discussed earlier, Shohid Minar has been rebuilt and Polton has been turned into an amusement park. Together, these places show how public memory can be changed or forgotten. Newmarket connects everyday life with politics. Maya goes there to buy sandals for Jait, but the shop assistant wrongfully assumes that Jait is his servant because the way he dressed. At the same time, student protesters nearby are attacked by the police. The place shows that ordinary life and political violence exist side by side at the same neighborhood. Mirpur Road appears throughout the novel. Maya travels along it when she first returns home, and it also leads to the scenes of political protest. It is always busy and always moving. It also reminds us that Dhaka is constantly growing and changing, just like the Mirpur Road. Sherebangla Nogor, also mentioned in the novel, it is the location of the National Parliament. Rehana described the parliament building as like a shapla flower floating in the river. This area represents the power and beauty of the state, but it also feels distant from the ordinary people outside its gates. Elephant Road is quieter and more personal place. It is where Maya and Joy meets in a cafe and slowly rebuild their relationship. Unlike political spaces in the novel, Elephant Road kind of represent hope and human connection. And Sohrawardi Uddan or Sohrawardi Field, the novel ends with this area. It is the place where Pakistani armies surrendered. Years later, the same place hosts 1992 tribunal movement. By the end of the novel, Tahmima Anam connects liberation war with continuing search for justice. So moving to the next slide. Overall, these places create a map of Dhaka that tells its own story. Every neighborhood reflects the different parts of Bangladesh's history, politics, and throughout this carefully chosen location, Tahmima Anam shows that Dhaka is more than a background in the novel. It is a living literary character that carries memory, conflict, and changes throughout the novel. Okay, to end my analysis, I would like to connect this novel with the ideas of two different urban theorists, George and Michel de Certeau. In the Metropolis and Mental Life, Himmel argues that people living in large cities develop a blasé attitude because they are constantly surrounded by the continuous shift of external and internal stimuli. He also argues that as a result, things begin to appear in a homogeneous flat and gray color, with no one of them worthy of being preferred to another. And we can see this in the Good Muslim, especially at Saima's party. Maya notices that people casually uses the word Alhamdulillah in everyday conversation. She remembers that once upon a time they would have laughed at people referring to God between every other sentences, but now everyone had caught it. This reflects Simmel's ideas that city life can make people's response automatic and personal. uh, George Simmel also argues that in a crowded urban area, one never feels as lonely and as deserted as in the metropolitan crush of persons. This describes Maya at the end of the novel. She stands among thousands of people at Sharaudi Uddan, but she is still alone with her grief over Jahid and her brother Sohail. Now moving to the next slide, Michel de Certeau in the Walking in the City, um, he makes a distinction between the concept city planned and controlled by those in power and the ordinary people who live down below the household at which feasibly begins. And this idea helps explain the contrast between the Irshad's propaganda and Maya's everyday movement throughout Dhaka. The huge posters of the dictator and the parliament building represent government attempts to control how the Dhaka is seen. They reflect what Desarto calls the concept city. In contrast, Maya's journey to rescue Jahid shows that how ordinary people move through the city in their own way. She travels by train, ferry, even hired boat and wear burqa to avoid attention. This is an example of Desarto calls a tactic. It is not strategy, it is tactic, that an everyday action that allows people to work within system they cannot openly challenge. Now moving to the next slide. Throughout this novel, Dhaka behaves like a living character. We can say that uh, it also grows, suffers, and changes. It also carries memories that the state tries to erase. It becomes a place where different political and religious ideas compete with one another. The Dhaka also influences Maya's political journey, Sohail's religious transformation, Jahid's fate, of course, and Joy's return to home, as well as Rehana's experience of loss. Their personal stories cannot be separated, uh, as far as I believe, cannot be separated from the places where they live and move within the area. By the end of the novel, at Shorodi Uddan, Pia gives her testimony in the public. In the end, the novel shows that Dhaka is not merely a setting for the novel, but an urban space that remembers, changes, influence people, uh, and carries the scars of the past of the liberation war. Uh, that is why Dhaka is not just a background, it is a living literary character that tells its own story. So I will end my discussion in here, and thank you, ma'am, for giving me the opportunity to present this novel. And these are all the references that I used. You can check it out. And thank you.